Transportation and communication systems are as important to a nation as any other single element in war or peace. In Japan, developing such systems was particularly difficult because of the mountainous and insular nature of the land. Among the most important features of the transportation system of a modern state is its railroads, and in Japan we find a modern system of rail travel. The gauge on these railroads is 3 feet 6 inches. The rolling stock is correspondingly light in weight, and the speed of the trains is generally slower than in America or Europe. The trains are not as ultra-modern as the super chiefs of the United States, nor are they as clean. But there is good rail coverage to the extent of some 17,000 miles. That's about twice the railroad mileage of the state of California. 2/3 of the rail system is state-owned. The few privately owned railroads are mainly feeders for the trunk lines owned by the state. In general, most of the railroads follow the coast to avoid the inland mountains. This coastline concentration makes the Japanese railroads very vulnerable to attack. The Japanese are great travelers, probably because the government has encouraged travel and has offered special rates for visits to ancient shrines and various scenic spots. This policy is part of the overall plan to build an intense nationalism and pride in the tradition of Japan. Trains are almost invariably crowded, and the degree of comfort found on a train depends on whether you happen to be traveling first, second, or third class. Dining cars are provided on many of the principal trains. These are 2 of Japan's crack express trains that feature the latest modern improvements. Equipment for maintaining rail lines is also pretty modern. During the heavy snows of winter, well-built and well-designed snow plows are used to clear the tracks. This is the rotary type in operation. It must be remembered that in the northern part of Japan, the snows are quite heavy, as they are in New England or our own Rocky Mountain region. Here's another kind of snow plow, the pusher type. The Japanese are enthusiastic ski fans, and in normal times, special trains are run to excellent winter resorts within a few hours' ride of the principal urban centers. The government has heartily encouraged participation in winter sports, thus simplifying the problem of training men for fighting in northern Manchuria, and for a short while, in the Aleutian Islands. As far as railroads are concerned, Tokyo might well be called the Chicago of Japan, inasmuch as it is the center of the Japanese railroad system. All trains going toward Tokyo are called up trains, and all trains moving from Tokyo are called down trains, regardless of whether or not Tokyo happens to be their destination or point of origin. Modern equipment for handling freight is found in all the principal cities. The freight cars aren't as heavy or as fast as the ones we're used to seeing, but they are well adapted to the short hauls required in this island country. In addition to the steam railroads, there is also considerable mileage that is electrically operated, principally in the vicinity of Tokyo and Osaka. Here is an electric line running through difficult mountainous country. There is a modern subway in Tokyo that runs through the center of the city. You'll notice that the subway station is as up-to-date as any you'll see in New York or Boston, and is operated in much the same fashion as those in the Western world, complete with change booths and turnstiles. Tokyo also has its elevated lines that run through the commercial, industrial, and residential sections of the city. The electrically operated interurban trains, with the subway and the elevated, handle hundreds of thousands of passengers daily and help solve the Tokyo transportation problem, which is equaled in complexity only by that of New York and London. The following collection of scenes will give you an idea of what the transportation situation is in one of the smaller metropolitan areas. This is Fukuoka, capital of Kyushu, a city of about 350,000 people. Fukuoka has about the same types of transportation you find in an average American city. There is a reasonably modern streetcar system that is efficiently operated. One thing you will notice about all Japanese transportation facilities is the overcrowding. It's no unusual sight to see long lines like this waiting to get on a streetcar. Notice the orderly fashion in which these docile people wait, even for a streetcar. Here's something unusual in America, a streetcar for watering the streets. Fukuoka also has a reasonably modern system of buses. Even before the war, many Japanese buses used charcoal for fuel because of the high cost of gasoline. This is another type of charcoal-burning bus. For many years before the war, women were used as bus conductors, a sight which did not become common in this country until the war brought us face to face with a manpower shortage. These women are usually very polite and will thank you for having ridden with them as you leave the bus. Here's one reason for the crowded railroads, streetcars, and buses in Japan. According to the last available pre-war figures, only about 1 person in 400 owned any kind of a motor vehicle, which means that a vast majority had to depend on methods of public transportation. This is much different from our own situation, where at least 1 family in 5 owns its own automobile. Of course, this condition is particularly noticeable in the urban areas, where there is a large concentration of office and professional workers. Of increasing importance in recent years has been the bus service established between most of the principal centers and feeding even many of the smaller communities. In pre-war times, buses were very often used by sightseers visiting Japan's scenic spots. Here's a typical conducted sightseeing tour. This girl is pointing out the interesting highlights of the trip. She's been thoroughly rehearsed in her part, and her memorized patter is especially designed to stimulate enthusiasm for Japan and all things Japanese. Often, these girls will sing songs to recall historic incidents. That's the bay where Admiral Perry first anchored his ships. Here, the tourists are on a road leading to Shimoda, and now they're on a typical Japanese country road. When lunchtime comes, the tourists open their box lunches and have a bite on the bus as they ride along through the countryside. The development of bus service and the foresight of the Army have been major factors in the development of Japan's highways. 15 years ago, there were no high-speed roads outside the principal cities. Today, there is an excellent road running the full length of the island of Honshu, near the east coast, and another route along the west coast of this most important of Japan's 4 islands. But for the most part, Japan's highways are narrow, poorly surfaced, and not suited for fast traveling. As in America, the school children hitch their rides to school on passing trucks. Many of the streets in the principal cities are wide, well-paved thoroughfares of the best type. On these travel almost all known types of motor conveyances. As can be seen from these pictures, almost all of these cars, trucks, and buses are of American or British make, since the Japanese have not been able to produce automobiles that can compete either in price or quality with the mass-produced product of the Western world. Here's a glimpse of some of the elegance of Japan's urban life in the best continental manner. By the way, that's a Japanese taxicab. Notice the right-hand drive denoting its British manufacture. Here's another one of Japan's new modern boulevards. There are also some 75,000 motorcycles in Japan proper. Here is a modern three-wheel delivery cycle belonging to a dry cleaning establishment. But Japan still uses some of the less modern means of transportation, such as the rickshaws. Oxen power is still used on the farms and in the rural areas. And bicycles, often with trailers hooked on the rear, are very numerous throughout the country. Wagons pulled by donkeys are no uncommon sight on the city boulevards. They are generally used for making small retail deliveries. Incidentally, making a delivery in Tokyo is no cinch, as the houses are not numbered consecutively, but the number is based on when the place was built. The oldest house on the street is number 1, and so on. Even in Tokyo, the modern sewage system is limited. For the most part, the toilet receptacle is a bucket. These containers are emptied frequently by collectors, and the product is delivered fresh to the farmer. This farmer is using an ordinary hog to transport his honey buckets to the field. Along with modern highways, a system of bridges has been developed. In Japan, we find many kinds. The most typically Japanese is the old-fashioned arched wooden bridge. Frequently, these have a religious significance and are favorite haunts of Japan's many picturesque pilgrims. Straight wooden bridges like these are usually constructed and maintained by the cooperative labor of the neighboring community. However, these types are completely inadequate to handle modern traffic, so Japan's engineers and architects have once again borrowed heavily from the Western world. Here are some modern steel and concrete bridges, very similar to structures to be seen spanning the Ohio, the Missouri, or the Thames rivers. Japan is primarily an island empire. Hence, its waterways and the sea are the basis of a tremendous amount of its transportation. If any people were born to be at home on water as much as on land, it is the Japanese. Their rivers, streams, and bays are filled with large numbers of little sculls, sampans, and fishing vessels. Their geographic position requires considerable waterborne transportation to carry on the inter-island and China coast traffic. Even in their recreation, these people make use of their many waterways. Here's a family spending a Sunday afternoon on a typical Japanese pleasure boat. The importance of fishing in Japan is indicated by large numbers of fishing craft. Many of these boats are powered by sail or ordinary oars. There are also some very modern deep-sea fishing boats that formerly ranged the Pacific Ocean from Kamchatka to Mexico. A few of these ships are actually floating canneries and are equipped so that after the fish are caught, they can be prepared and canned at sea, hundreds of miles from the home port. In recent years, Japan's shipbuilding program has expanded rapidly. Next to Britain and the United States, she possesses the largest shipping tonnage of any country in the world. Prior to the war, her ocean-going vessels had established trade routes to all the important countries of the world. Cheap construction cost, along with low operating expenses, enabled them to carry freight and passengers at rates far below those profitable to the merchant marine of any other maritime power. In addition, the shipping program was subsidized by the government. In 1940, Japanese lines held a major position in the traffic of all the oceans but the North Atlantic, and they operated 2 round-the-world lines. All of the latest Japanese ships were built in Japanese yards and were powered with Japanese-made motors and engines. Certainly, Japan has made progress in ship transportation, and she might shortly have dominated the world's ocean-going traffic had she remained at peace. Air travel as a means of transportation had begun to develop in the years preceding the war. This is one of the several modern airports that had sprung up in Japan proper. Most of the passenger planes that were used by the commercial lines were manufactured by Douglas Aircraft in America. Commercial aviation would probably have developed much faster if the terrain and climate had not made flying very hazardous. About 8 months out of the year, Japan has unfavorable flying weather. During this time, the high mountain tops are often hidden by heavy mist and clouds. That's an aerial view of the famous Mount Fuji. Modern communication systems have also developed considerably in the last quarter century. Radio broadcasting, although not up to the standard of American radio, has made great progress. Broadcasting has been under government control since the beginning. Every radio receiver in Japan is licensed, and the owner is required to pay a few cents a month for the privilege of listening to the government broadcasting stations. As in most other fields of mechanical invention, the Japanese have made little, if any, improvement in radio. Their broadcasting and receiving facilities are patterned on those in use in the Western world. You can tell from this modern studio that they have copied successfully. That's the Japanese Navy band broadcasting a program. Today, the chief purposes of Japanese broadcasting are to spread propaganda and to indoctrinate the listener with nationalistic culture and ideas. Almost every family in the urban areas possesses a radio of some kind, while in the poorer rural districts, the number of sets per capita is much lower. As you can see, these radios aren't comparable to the pre-war radios in America. Radio listening is a very popular pastime. and although they often have nothing more than small crystal sets with earphones, they're still ardent radio fans. Although the initial cost of a radio is actually very low, many families cannot afford to own one because of the continual small drain government taxes impose on radio owners. Likewise, Japan has telegraph communication that is operated by the imperial government. She apparently lacks modern telegraphic equipment, but she does have a well-coordinated telegraph system that covers some 31,000 miles. They also have modern daily newspapers. This is Newspaper Row in Tokyo. Before the war, there were about 7,000 newspapers in Japan proper, many of them with very large circulations. There has never been a free press in Japan, as there is in the United States. The police keep the editors informed of subjects that are not to be mentioned in the columns of their newspapers. Libel laws don't exist, and there is no limit to exploiting scandal as long as it doesn't concern the imperial government. The composition of a newspaper requires much more manpower than our own dailies. Type has to be set by hand, since no linotype machines have been invented that can handle the many thousands of characters used. Newspaper advertising in the large dailies is relatively small. However, since the circulations are large, the papers are still able to show a profit without much advertising revenue. Newspapers are sold in Japan as they are in this country, at the corner newsstand. The newspapers have the best facilities for covering the news photographically. A carrier pigeon is going along on this plane to bring some news pictures back. As the plane gets over a North China city, the photographer snaps an aerial photograph. This plane is a regular photographic studio in the sky. It is equipped with facilities for shooting, developing, and printing photographs of all types. The plane also has equipment for sending in any late news by radio. As soon as the best photographs are selected, captions are written to accompany them. Then they are placed in a capsule and tied on the carrier pigeon. The pigeons are released, and when they walk in their front door, they've completed their job of delivering the photographs. The source of much of the hydroelectric power in Japan comes from the south center of the mountainous island of Honshu. It is here that two of Japan's main rivers, the Kyushu and the Tenryū, rise and flow rapidly to the sea. Most of the hydroelectric power produced in this area goes to the vital industrial center of Nagoya, and power is transmitted as far north as Tokyo. Electricity is of tremendous social and economic importance in Japan, since it is the first bit of modernism that has been brought into the Japanese home. But the primary reason why electricity is of such importance in Japan is the growing scarcity of fuel and the comparative abundance of actual and potential sources of water power. Japan's mountainous terrain and her comparatively heavy and fairly well-distributed precipitation are responsible for the great hydroelectric potential. The short, swift-flowing rivers descending rapidly through the mountain gorges provide many ideal sites for hydroelectric plants. Japan went into World War II with about 1/4 of her hydroelectric potential developed. According to the last figures, Japan has a potential of 15 million kilowatts of hydroelectric power, and in 1937, the figures show that she had only developed about 3,880,000 kilowatts. It is doubtful if any additional plants have been built during the war, partly because of wartime lack of steel and construction skill, and partly because she was expending considerable energy and a large amount of her resources in the completing of huge hydroelectric projects in Korea and Manchuria. In spite of the universal use of electricity in Japan, the figures show the per capita consumption has been comparatively low. 343 kilowatt hours in 1936, opposed to 868 in the United States. Here's the interior of a Japanese power plant. It's interesting to notice that these generators are American-made. Today, however, the Japanese do have their own manufacturing plants for making electric power machinery and equipment. This is the powerhouse control board. And here is an out-of-door transformer station. In Japan, the charge for electricity to the household consumer is generally based on the number of outlets in a house, rather than the amount of power used. In some farming areas of Japan, the windmill is still used as a source of electric power. The wind is harnessed to generate the power necessary for operating the single 10-watt bulb that is the only light found in many Japanese homes. In conclusion, we see in Japan a country that has grown in the last 75 years from a feudal agricultural economy into a first-rate industrial empire, assisted largely by the development of adequate transportation and communication systems.